The mop bucket rattled as Bobby Chen pushed it down the polished corridor of Fort Harrison's administrative building. To Captain Jason Brooks, he was just another invisible face keeping the base clean. Probably never even held a weapon, Brooks muttered to his companion, watching the 62-year-old custodian's slow, methodical movements. But when Colonel Patricia Williams rounded the corner and caught sight of the faded tattoo on Bobby's exposed forearm, her world stopped spinning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Those numbers and letters weren't random marks on aged skin. They were her son's final words, transmitted in military code moments before an enemy mortar ended his life in Afghanistan. The same transmission that only one person could have heard clearly enough to memorize forever. The first alarm at Fort Harrison rang at 0500 every morning, but Bobby Chen had been awake for 30 minutes already. His small apartment off base was sparse, military in its precision, despite housing a civilian employee. A single photograph sat on the nightstand, 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, standing beside a communications truck, their faces young and confident under the Afghan sun. Bobby's fingers traced the glass each morning, pausing over one face in particular before starting his day. The drive to Fort Harrison took 18 minutes through the Colorado morning mist, past the familiar sight of Rocky Mountain peaks that never failed to remind him of the Hindu Kush. Bobby's weathered Honda Civic pulled into the employee parking lot as the base came alive around him. Soldiers jogged in formation along the perimeter road, their cadence calls echoing off the brick buildings that had housed 3 generations of American warriors. Bobby Chen moved like a man who understood the weight of routine. His custodial cart was organized with the same precision he'd once applied to radio equipment, every bottle, brush, and cleaning supply in its designated place. At 62, his black hair was streaked with silver, and deep lines mapped the corners of his eyes like topographical charts of worry and memory. His shoulders carried a slight stoop from decades of manual labor, but there was something in his posture that spoke of discipline never fully abandoned. The morning shift began in Building 47, the administrative heart of Fort Harrison. Bobby entered through the service entrance, his keycard granting access to corridors where colonels and captains planned training exercises and deployment schedules. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he made his way to the supply closet, pulling on latex gloves with the same methodical care he'd once used to handle classified communication equipment. His uniform was simple, navy blue coveralls with Fort Harrison facilities embroidered on the back, steel-toed boots that had seen better years, and a long-sleeved undershirt that he wore regardless of season. The sleeves served a purpose beyond warmth, concealing the ink that covered his left forearm like a permanent reminder of promises kept and voices forever silenced. Bobby began his route on the 3rd floor, where junior officers maintained small offices filled with training manuals and motivational posters about leadership and honor. He moved quietly, emptying wastebaskets and wiping down surfaces while the building gradually filled with the morning bustle of military bureaucracy. Most personnel barely acknowledged his presence. Custodians occupied that invisible space between noticed and forgotten, essential but unremarkable. The work suited him. After 38 years of maintaining radio silence and following communication protocols, Bobby found comfort in the predictable nature of cleaning schedules and maintenance logs. There were no life-or-death decisions in mopping floors, no split-second choices that could save or doom the soldiers depending on his voice reaching the right frequency at the right moment. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez was the first officer to arrive that morning, her heels clicking against the polished linoleum as she hurried toward her office with a coffee cup in one hand and a stack of personnel files in the other. She nodded briefly at Bobby, a perfunctory acknowledgement that had become routine over the 3 years he'd worked this building. Rodriguez was fair in her treatment of support staff, neither particularly warm nor dismissive, simply professional in the way that junior officers learn to navigate the complex social hierarchy of military life. Bobby appreciated her consistency. He'd learned to read the subtle cues that indicated how his day might unfold, which officers would treat him as furniture, which might offer a brief greeting, and which might actually engage in conversation. Rodriguez fell into the middle category, polite but distant, focused on her own responsibilities in a way that left little room for curiosity about the people who kept her workspace clean. The morning progressed with familiar rhythm. Bobby worked his way down the corridor, past offices where majors reviewed training schedules and captains prepared briefings for their commanders. The sound of keyboards clicking and phones ringing created a backdrop of productivity that reminded him of the communications centers where he'd spent 2 decades of his life, though those had carried the urgent energy of operations in progress rather than the steady hum of peacetime administration. Captain Jason Brooks arrived precisely at 0730, his timing as predictable as his attitude. 28 years old, with the kind of sharp-edged confidence that came from excelling in training exercises but never facing real combat, Brooks carried himself like a man who believed his rank entitled him to deference from everyone in his path. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing textbook perfect, and his manner toward enlisted personnel and civilians suggested someone who had never learned that respect flowed in all directions. Bobby had observed Brooks for months, noting the way he spoke to the younger soldiers, the dismissive tone he used with administrative staff, and the particular disdain he seemed to reserve for anyone he perceived as beneath his station. It was a familiar type. Bobby had served under officers like Brooks early in his career, men who confused authority with superiority and mistook compliance for respect. This morning, Brooks brought a companion. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez had been joined by another young officer, and their conversation carried the easy camaraderie of people who shared similar backgrounds and assumptions about their place in the world. They discussed weekend plans and compared notes about upcoming training exercises while Bobby continued his work around them, his presence as unremarkable as the furniture they leaned against. The custodial cart squeaked slightly as Bobby maneuvered it around the corner toward the main corridor. The building was fully operational now, with personnel moving between offices and conference rooms in the organized chaos of a military workday. Bobby had learned to time his movements to avoid the heaviest foot traffic, understanding instinctively how to remain invisible while still accomplishing his assigned tasks. It was near the end of his morning route that the day took its first turn towards something different. Bobby was refilling paper towel dispensers in the men's room when he heard voices approaching in the corridor outside. Captain Brooks was explaining something to Lieutenant Rodriguez about proper military bearing, his voice carrying the pedagogical tone of someone who enjoyed being the authority in any conversation. The problem with this generation of soldiers, Brooks was saying, is they don't understand the hierarchy that makes everything work. Everyone thinks they deserve respect just for showing up, but respect is earned through service and achievement. Rodriguez murmured agreement, though her tone suggested polite attention, rather than genuine engagement with Brooks' lecture on military virtue. Bobby continued his work, accustomed to overhearing conversations that weren't meant for his ears. Custodians learned early that invisibility came with the inadvertent privilege of witnessing the unguarded moments when people spoke freely. Take the support staff, for example, Brooks continued, his voice growing louder as they passed the restroom door. Civilians who work on base but never served never put their lives on the line. They provide a service, sure, but it's not the same as military service. It's just a job to them. Bobby's hand paused on the paper towel dispenser. The conversation wasn't directed at him, but it carried the casual dismissal that had become familiar over his years in this position. He'd grown accustomed to being categorized as just another civilian employee, someone whose previous life remained invisible to those who measured worth by current uniform and rank. The voices faded as Brooks and Rodriguez continued down the corridor, leaving Bobby alone with his thoughts and the quiet efficiency of his work routine. He finished restocking the dispensers, gathered his supplies, and prepared to move to the next phase of his morning schedule. The encounter was unremarkable in its content, but significant in its timing. It established the baseline of assumption and attitude that would make the day's later events all the more powerful. Bobby's morning route concluded in the building's main lobby, where a wall of photographs honored Fort Harrison's recent Medal of Honor recipients and fallen soldiers. He'd walked past this memorial hundreds of times, but today he paused, his eyes finding a familiar name etched in black granite. Lieutenant Michael Williams, KIA Afghanistan, November 19, 2019. The photograph showed a young man with his mother's eyes and his father's determined jawline, wearing the uniform of a communications officer, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing his job could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Bobby stared at the memorial for longer than usual, his left arm unconsciously flexing beneath his long sleeves. The tattoo hidden there seemed to pulse with phantom heat, as if the ink itself remembered the desert heat and the crackling static of a dying radio connection. 5 years had passed since that November morning when everything changed, but the weight of those final transmitted words remained as heavy as the day he'd first heard them through his headphones. The lobby was quiet except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of vehicles starting up in the parking lot outside. Bobby's reflection stared back at him from the polished granite, superimposed over the list of names like a ghost haunting the memorial of the dead. He reached out briefly, his fingertips touching the cold stone where Michael Williams' name was carved, then stepped back and resumed his work. The morning shift was ending, but Bobby's day was far from over. His afternoon schedule would take him to different areas of the base, including the communications center, where active-duty soldiers maintained the same kind of radio equipment he'd operated for 2 decades, in deserts and mountains, half a world away. Those visits were always the hardest, filled with the sounds and smells that transported him instantly back to Forward Operating Base Phoenix and the last transmission he'd ever received from a soldier named Michael Williams. But first he had to navigate the changing of the guard as the day shift personnel arrived and the night shift prepared to depart. It was during these transitional moments that Bobby often encountered the full spectrum of military culture, from the respectful professionalism of seasoned NCOs to preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The casual arrogance of junior officers who had never learned that the true measure of a soldier was found not in their rank, but in their willingness to serve something larger than themselves. Bobby Chen pushed his cart toward the service elevator, ready to begin the afternoon portion of his route. The building around him bustled with the energy of an organization perpetually in motion, planning training exercises and deployment rotations, with the kind of detailed precision that kept America's military functioning across the globe. He remained invisible within this machinery, a necessary but unremarkable component, whose personal history stayed buried beneath the simple uniform of a civilian contractor. The elevator doors closed behind him, and Bobby caught his reflection in the polished steel. For just a moment he saw not the aging custodian, but the young staff sergeant, who had once been trusted with the voices of soldiers in combat, whose steady hands and calm voice had guided helicopters through hostile territory, and coordinated the kind of operations that never appeared in newspapers but determined whether warriors came home alive. The reflection faded as the elevator climbed toward the second floor, where Bobby would spend his afternoon cleaning offices and conference rooms, while the officers who occupied them planned exercises and training scenarios. They would see him as they always did, an older man with a mop and bucket, invisible in his utility, unremarkable in his presence. None of them suspected that Bobby Chen carried within his memory the final words of heroes, or that the ink beneath his sleeves preserved the last transmission of a soldier whose mother now commanded the very base where Bobby worked, in anonymity. The day was about to change all of that, but for now, he remained exactly what he appeared to be, a custodian doing his job with quiet competence, carrying secrets that would reshape everything once they were finally revealed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Building 47 as Bobby Chen emerged from the service elevator on the second floor. His cart rolled smoothly across the polished linoleum, past conference rooms where staff meetings droned on behind closed doors. The building had settled into its midday rhythm, a blend of focused work and casual conversation that Bobby had learned to navigate without disrupting the flow of military business. The communications wing occupied the eastern corridor of the second floor, its walls lined with offices housing the personnel responsible for coordinating radio traffic, satellite communications, and secure transmissions across Fort Harrison's network. Bobby's route through this section always carried particular weight, surrounded as he was by the tools and technology that had defined his previous life. The familiar beeping of encryption devices and the low hum of radio equipment created a soundtrack that transported him instantly across decades and continents. Captain Brooks had established himself in Conference Room 2B, where he was conducting what appeared to be an informal briefing for several junior officers. Through the glass walls, Bobby could see him gesturing at a whiteboard covered with organizational charts and training schedules. His voice carried clearly into the hallway, projecting the kind of authority that came naturally to men who had never questioned their right to command others. Military bearing isn't just about looking the part, Brooks was explaining to his audience. It's about understanding your place in the hierarchy and respecting the chain of command. Every person on this base has a role to play, and success depends on everyone understanding their position. Bobby continued his work, emptying wastebaskets and wiping down surfaces while the briefing continued. Lieutenant Rodriguez sat at the conference table, taking notes with the diligence of someone who understood that junior officers were expected to absorb wisdom from their superiors regardless of its practical value. Two other lieutenants flanked her, their attention focused on Brooks with the kind of respectful attention that military protocol demanded. The challenge we face, Brooks continued, is maintaining standards when we're surrounded by civilians who don't understand military culture. Support staff, contractors, local employees. They provide necessary services, but they don't share our commitment to excellence and discipline. Bobby's hand paused briefly on the glass surface he was cleaning. The comment wasn't directed at him specifically, but it carried the casual dismissal that had become a familiar undercurrent in his daily interactions. He'd grown accustomed to being categorized as an outsider, someone whose presence was tolerated, but whose contributions were measured in terms of basic functionality, rather than meaningful service. The conference room door opened as Bobby moved past, and Captain Brooks stepped into the hallway. His timing seemed calculated to intersect with Bobby's route, creating one of those moments when the invisible became momentarily visible. Brooks glanced at the custodial cart, then at Bobby himself, his expression carrying the kind of polite indifference reserved for people who occupied necessary but unremarkable roles. "Excuse me," Brooks said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Could you come back and clean this room later? We're in the middle of an important briefing." Bobby nodded respectfully, understanding that the request was really a command disguised as courtesy. "Of course, sir. I'll return when you're finished." Brooks studied Bobby for a moment, his gaze taking in the aging custodian's weathered features and work-worn hands. "You've been working this building for a while now, haven't you?" 3 years, sir," Bobby replied, his voice carrying the neutral tone he'd perfected for interactions with officers who saw him as part of the building's infrastructure rather than as a person with his own history and experience. "Good," Brooks said, though his tone suggested that longevity in a custodial position was hardly worthy of praise. "Consistency is important in support roles. People depend on you to keep things clean and running smoothly." The casual condescension in Brooks' voice was unmistakable, delivered with the kind of practiced authority that reduced Bobby to his current function without acknowledging any possibility of depth or previous experience. Bobby had encountered this attitude countless times over his 3 years at Fort Harrison, from officers who saw civilian employees as interchangeable components in the military machine. "I understand, sir," Bobby said, maintaining the deferential tone that civilian employees were expected to use when addressing military personnel. "I'll make sure not to interrupt your training." Brooks nodded approvingly, satisfied with Bobby's appropriate response to his authority. "That's the kind of attitude we need more of around here. Understanding your role and executing it without complications." The brief exchange might have ended there, but Lieutenant Rodriguez chose that moment to join the conversation. She stepped into the hallway, her expression carrying curiosity about the custodian who had become the subject of her captain's impromptu lecture on military hierarchy. "Mr. Chen has been very reliable," Rodriguez offered, her tone carrying the kind of professional courtesy that junior officers learn to display toward support staff. "Always thorough, never disruptive." Brooks glanced at Rodriguez, then back at Bobby, his expression suggesting that reliability in custodial work was exactly what he expected from civilian employees. That's good to hear. It's important that everyone understands their contribution to the mission, even if that contribution is maintaining clean facilities. The comment hung in the air with the weight of casual dismissal, positioning Bobby's work as necessary, but fundamentally different from the real military service that Brooks and his colleagues provided. Bobby had heard variations of this sentiment countless times, from officers who genuinely believed that military service created an unbridgeable gap between those who had worn the uniform and those who had not. "The mission requires support from everyone," Bobby said quietly, his voice carrying just enough conviction to suggest depths that Brooks had not bothered to explore. "Everyone has a role to play." Brooks raised an eyebrow at Bobby's response, seemingly surprised that a custodian would offer commentary on military operations. "That's true, but some roles are more critical than others. Combat veterans understand the difference between supporting the mission and actually executing it." The word veterans carried particular weight in Brooks' pronunciation, clearly intended to distinguish between those who had earned the right to speak about military service and those who had not. Bobby absorbed the comment without visible reaction, though his left arm tingled slightly, where the hidden tattoo preserved the memory of radio transmissions that had guided soldiers through firefights and coordinated evacuations under enemy fire. "I'm sure you've seen your share of action," Rodriguez said to Brooks, her tone carrying the kind of admiration that junior officers were expected to display toward their superiors. "Your deployment experience gives you perspective that the rest of us can learn from." Brooks straightened slightly, clearly pleased by Rodriguez's recognition of his combat credentials. "2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. You learn quickly that military service isn't just a job, it's a calling. The civilians who work on base provide valuable support, but they'll never understand the weight of making life-and-death decisions in combat." Bobby's hands continued their methodical work, wiping down surfaces with practiced efficiency, while the conversation continued around him. His expression remained neutral, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of subtle change that might have been noticed by someone trained to read body language under stress. "Mr. Chen," Brooks said suddenly, his tone carrying the kind of casual authority that expected immediate attention. "You've been listening to our conversation about military service. Do you have any thoughts on the difference between civilian support roles and actual military service?" The question was clearly intended as a test, an opportunity for Brooks to demonstrate his point about the fundamental differences between those who had served and those who had not. Bobby looked up from his work, his expression calm and respectful, though his eyes carried depths that Brooks had not bothered to explore. "I think," Bobby said carefully, "that service takes many forms, and sometimes the most important contributions come from places that people don't expect." Brooks smiled condescendingly, clearly satisfied with what he interpreted as Bobby's admission of civilian inferiority. "That's a diplomatic answer, but it doesn't really address the question. Military service requires a level of commitment and sacrifice that civilian work simply doesn't demand." "I understand your point, sir," Bobby replied, his voice remaining steady despite the casual dismissal of his perspective. "Military service does require significant commitment." "Exactly," Brooks said, turning back to Rodriguez as if Bobby had confirmed his thesis about the unbridgeable gap between military and civilian experience. "It's important that everyone understands their place in the hierarchy. Civilian employees provide valuable support, but they're not soldiers." Rodriguez nodded agreement, though her expression suggested some discomfort with the direction of the conversation. Bobby had always been respectful and professional in their interactions, and she seemed to recognize that Brooks' lecturing was unnecessary and potentially offensive. "Mr. Chen has always been very professional," Rodriguez said, her tone carrying subtle support for the custodian who had become the unwitting subject of Brooks' demonstration of military superiority. "I think we can all appreciate good work regardless of someone's background." Brooks waved dismissively, clearly uninterested in Rodriguez's attempt to moderate his position. "Of course we appreciate good work, but let's not pretend that mopping floors carries the same weight as leading soldiers in combat." There's a reason we have different uniforms and different responsibilities. Bobby's cleaning cloth moved in steady circles across the surface of a nearby table, his movements betraying no emotion despite the casual condescension directed at his current role. He'd learned long ago that arguing with officers who had already decided what he represented would only confirm their assumptions about civilian employees who didn't understand their place in the military hierarchy. "I should let you get back to your briefing," Bobby said, his tone carrying the kind of respectful deference that Brooks expected from support staff. "I'll return to clean the conference room when you're finished." "Good," Brooks replied, clearly satisfied with Bobby's acknowledgement of his secondary status. "We'll probably be another hour or so. Important training that requires our full attention." Bobby nodded and began pushing his cart toward the next section of his route, leaving Brooks and Rodriguez to return to their briefing. The exchange had been brief but significant, establishing the casual dismissal that would make subsequent events all the more powerful. Bobby had been categorized, dismissed, and relegated to his current function, without any acknowledgement of the possibility that his past might contain experiences that rivaled or exceeded those of his critics. The afternoon continued with familiar rhythm as Bobby worked his way through the communications wing. The offices around him buzzed with the activity of personnel managing radio networks, satellite communications, and secure transmissions that connected Fort Harrison to military installations around the world. The technology had evolved significantly since Bobby's active duty years, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Clear communication could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. In one office, a young sergeant was troubleshooting interference on a secure channel, his headphones clamped over his ears as he adjusted frequency settings with practiced precision. Bobby paused briefly, recognizing the concentrated focus that came with responsibility for maintaining communications in high-stakes environments. The sergeant's uniform bore the distinctive insignia of a communications specialist, the same branch Bobby had served in for 20 years before his retirement. "Trouble with the encryption?" Bobby asked quietly, his voice carrying genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. The sergeant looked up, surprised that a custodian would recognize the technical nature of his work. "Just some interference on the secure channels. Probably atmospheric conditions affecting the satellite uplink." Bobby nodded knowingly, though he kept his expression neutral to avoid drawing attention to his familiarity with communications equipment. "Solar activity can disrupt satellite signals, especially during peak transmission hours." The sergeant's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not expecting technical insight from a member of the custodial staff. "That's right. You seem to know something about radio communications." "I've picked up a few things over the years," Bobby replied, maintaining the vague tone that had become his standard response to questions about his background. "Working around military equipment, you learn to recognize the basics." The explanation seemed to satisfy the sergeant, who returned to his troubleshooting with renewed focus. Bobby resumed his cleaning, though his eyes lingered on the familiar array of radio equipment that had once been as familiar to him as his own hands. The sight of frequency dials and encryption devices triggered muscle memory that 3 years of custodial work had not erased. The encounter was brief, but significant, representing the kind of moment when Bobby's hidden expertise almost broke through the surface of his carefully maintained anonymity. The sergeant had recognized something in Bobby's comments that suggested knowledge beyond casual observation, but the interaction ended before deeper questions could be asked. Bobby continued his route through the communications wing, past offices where personnel managed the complex web of radio traffic that kept Fort Harrison connected to the broader military network. The familiar sounds of radio chatter and equipment operation created a backdrop of memories that Bobby had learned to navigate without betraying the depth of his emotional connection to this environment. As he worked, Bobby became aware of a growing buzz of conversation in the offices around him. Personnel were clustered around computer screens, their voices carrying the kind of excited energy that accompanied breaking news or significant developments. Bobby's training had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of information spreading through military channels, and something was clearly circulating through the communications wing. "Did you see the video from the commissary?" one voice asked, though Bobby couldn't identify the speaker from his position in the hallway. "The one with the old lady and the jacket?" Another voice replied. "Yeah, that went viral pretty quickly." Someone really thought they were going to embarrass a veteran. Bobby's attention sharpened as he recognized the conversation's direction. Military installations were small communities where news traveled quickly, and apparently some incident at the commissary had captured the attention of Fort Harrison's personnel. The details were unclear, but the tone suggested that someone had been caught making assumptions about a veteran's service record. "I heard she was actually Special Forces or something," a third voice added. "Some kind of classified unit that got erased from the records." The conversation continued as Bobby moved past, but the fragments he caught suggested a story about hidden military service being revealed in dramatic fashion. The scenario was familiar to anyone who had served in classified or sensitive roles, where official records might not reflect the full scope of someone's military experience. Bobby's own situation was different but parallel. His service record was complete and accurate, but his current role as a custodian created assumptions about his background that he had never bothered to correct. The conversation about the commissary incident reminded him of how quickly perceptions could change once hidden truths were revealed. The afternoon was advancing toward evening as Bobby completed his route through the communications wing. The building's energy was shifting as personnel prepared for the end of the duty day, with conversations turning from work-related topics to evening plans and weekend activities. Bobby's timing had been carefully calibrated to avoid disrupting the flow of military business, while ensuring that all assigned areas received proper attention. As he prepared to move to the next section of his route, Bobby encountered Captain Brooks again, this time in the corridor outside the communications center. Brooks was reviewing a clipboard of training schedules while walking toward the elevator, his attention focused on the paperwork, until he noticed Bobby's approach. "Mr. Chen," Brooks said, his tone carrying the kind of casual authority that had characterized their earlier interaction. "I trust you've been keeping our communications personnel properly supported." "Yes, sir," Bobby replied, maintaining the respectful tone that Brooks expected from civilian employees. "Everything is clean and ready for tomorrow's operations." Brooks nodded approvingly, clearly satisfied with Bobby's acknowledgement of his secondary role in supporting the real military mission. "Good. It's important that everyone understands their contribution to operational readiness, even if that contribution is maintaining clean facilities." The comment carried the same casual dismissal that had marked their earlier conversation, positioning Bobby's work as necessary but fundamentally different from the real military service that Brooks and his colleagues provided. Bobby absorbed the remark without visible reaction, though his left arm tingled slightly where the hidden tattoo preserved memories of radio transmissions that had guided soldiers through combat operations. "I understand, sir," Bobby said, his voice carrying the kind of professional deference that civilian employees were expected to display toward military personnel. "Clean facilities support mission effectiveness." Brooks smiled condescendingly, clearly pleased with Bobby's appropriate response to his authority. "Exactly. That's the kind of attitude we need more of around here. Understanding your role and executing it without complications." The brief exchange concluded as Brooks stepped into the elevator, leaving Bobby alone in the corridor with his cart and his carefully maintained anonymity. The encounter had been unremarkable in its content, but significant in its reinforcement of the assumptions that would make subsequent events all the more powerful. Bobby's afternoon route continued through the administrative sections of Building 47, where personnel managed the complex paperwork that kept Fort Harrison functioning as a military installation. The offices around him buzzed with the activity of processing personnel records, training schedules, and operational reports that connected the base to the broader military network. The day was advancing toward its conclusion, but Bobby's most significant encounter was yet to come. The routine interactions with Captain Brooks had established the baseline of casual dismissal that would make the eventual revelation all the more dramatic. Bobby remained exactly what he appeared to be, a custodian doing his job with quiet competence, carrying secrets that would reshape everything once they were finally revealed. As he pushed his cart toward the service elevator, Bobby caught sight of his reflection in the polished metal doors. For just a moment, he saw not the aging custodian, but the young staff sergeant, who had once been trusted with the voices of soldiers in combat, whose steady hands and calm voice had coordinated the kind of operations that determined whether warriors came home alive. The reflection faded as the elevator doors opened, and Bobby stepped inside with his cart and his hidden history. The building around him continued its daily rhythm, unaware that one of its most invisible employees carried within his memory the final words of heroes, preserved in ink beneath his sleeves like a permanent reminder of promises kept and voices forever silenced. The evening shift change at Fort Harrison created a unique dynamic in Building 47, as day personnel prepared to depart while night security and essential operations staff arrived for their duties. Bobby Chen found himself navigating this transitional period with particular care, understanding that shift changes often brought together personnel who might not normally interact, creating opportunities for both casual conversation and unexpected conflict. The communications center remained active during shift transitions, with incoming personnel receiving briefings on ongoing operations and equipment status. Bobby's cleaning schedule placed him in this environment precisely when the day's accumulated tensions and casual conversations reached their peak intensity. Officers who had spent the afternoon discussing training protocols and military standards now found themselves with time for more relaxed interaction, often leading to the kind of unguarded commentary that revealed true attitudes toward the support staff who kept their facilities functioning. Captain Brooks had lingered past his normal departure time, using the communications center's secure phone system to coordinate training schedules with other installations. His conversation was conducted in the kind of elevated tone that suggested either the importance of his coordination efforts or his desire to ensure that nearby personnel understood his central role in upcoming exercises. Bobby worked methodically around the communication equipment, his movements carefully timed to avoid interfering with the captain's call while ensuring that all surfaces received proper attention. "Negative, we can't move the exercise forward," Brooks was saying into the secure handset, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected training schedules across multiple units. "Our communication systems need to be fully integrated before we can run realistic scenarios." Bobby paused briefly in his cleaning routine, recognizing the technical terminology that Brooks was using to describe radio coordination requirements. The captain's explanation was accurate, but somewhat simplified, focusing on basic integration protocols rather than the complex frequency management and encryption coordination that real-world operations demanded. Bobby's experience with combat communications had taught him that successful coordination required understanding dozens of variables that training exercises rarely replicated. Lieutenant Rodriguez entered the communications center as Brooks concluded his call, her arrival timed to coincide with the shift change that would transfer responsibility for evening operations to night personnel. She carried a folder of personnel evaluations that required Brooks's signature, creating an opportunity for the kind of informal conversation that often revealed more about military culture than formal briefings. "Sir, I have those evaluation reports ready for your review," Rodriguez said, placing the folder on the desk next to Brooks' position. "Most of the ratings are straightforward, but there are a few cases that might require additional documentation." Brooks accepted the folder with the kind of casual authority that characterized his interactions with subordinate officers. "Any particular personnel issues I should be aware of?" "Nothing serious," Rodriguez replied, though her tone suggested some hesitation about raising specific concerns. "Just some questions about performance standards for support staff and civilian employees." Bobby continued his work around the edges of the communications center, his presence so familiar that both officers seemed to forget he was within earshot of their conversation. The discussion of performance standards carried particular significance for civilian employees, whose job security depended on military personnel's assessment of their contribution to mission effectiveness. "The challenge with civilian employees," Brooks said, opening the evaluation folder, "is establishing meaningful performance metrics when their work doesn't directly contribute to combat readiness. Support functions are necessary, but they're fundamentally different from military service." Rodriguez nodded agreement, though her expression suggested some uncertainty about the distinction Brooks was drawing between military and civilian contributions. The custodial staff has been very reliable. Mr. Chen, for example, has maintained consistent performance standards throughout his time here. Bobby's hand paused briefly on the equipment cabinet he was cleaning, recognizing his name in the conversation but maintaining his focus on his assigned tasks. His performance evaluations had consistently rated him as exceeding expectations, though he understood that excellence in custodial work was measured differently from military achievement. Reliability is important, Brooks acknowledged, though his tone suggested that consistent custodial performance was hardly worthy of special recognition. But we need to maintain perspective about the difference between doing a job well and actual service to the mission. The conversation continued as Bobby worked his way around the communication equipment, his movements creating a steady rhythm of professional activity that provided background to the officers' discussion of performance standards and military culture. Brooks' comments carried the casual authority of someone who had never questioned his assumptions about the relative value of different types of service. Mr. Chen seems to understand his role very well, Rodriguez observed, her tone carrying professional respect for Bobby's consistent performance. He's never caused any disruptions or complications with his work. That's exactly what we need from support staff, Brooks replied, his voice carrying satisfaction with Bobby's appropriate behavior. Understanding their place in the hierarchy and executing their responsibilities without requiring management attention. Bobby absorbed the comments without visible reaction, though his left arm tingled slightly, where the hidden tattoo preserved memories of radio coordination that had determined the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. The casual dismissal of his current role as simply understanding his place carried ironic weight given the leadership responsibilities he had once carried in combat environments. The shift change process brought additional personnel into the communications center, including Staff Sergeant David Thompson, who supervised the night maintenance crew responsible for equipment upkeep and facility security. Thompson was a career NCO with 15 years of active duty experience, his bearing reflecting the kind of practical competence that came from years of hands-on responsibility for keeping complex systems operational. "Evening, sir," Thompson said to Brooks, his greeting carrying the respectful tone that enlisted personnel used when addressing commissioned officers. "The night crew is ready to take over equipment monitoring if you're finished with your coordination calls." Brooks acknowledged Thompson's report with a nod, then gestured toward Bobby, who was cleaning communication equipment near the secure radio array. "Make sure your people understand that civilian employees need supervision when they're working around sensitive equipment. We can't have unsupervised access to classified systems." Thompson glanced at Bobby, his expression carrying mild confusion about the captain's concern. "Mr. Chen has been cleared for work in this area for 3 years, sir. He's never had any security incidents or equipment problems." "I'm sure he's been reliable," Brooks replied, his tone suggesting that past performance didn't eliminate the need for ongoing vigilance. "But civilian employees don't have the same understanding of security protocols that military personnel develop through training and experience." Bobby continued his methodical cleaning while the conversation proceeded around him, his presence so familiar that the discussion of security concerns seemed to treat him as part of the equipment rather than a person capable of understanding the implications of their words. Thompson's expression suggested some discomfort with Brooks' characterization of civilian employees as inherently less trustworthy than military personnel. "Sir, Mr. Chen has consistently demonstrated appropriate security awareness," Thompson said carefully, his tone carrying subtle support for Bobby's professional competence. "His work has never created any concerns about equipment security or operational security." Brooks waved dismissively, clearly uninterested in Thompson's defense of civilian employee reliability. "I'm not questioning his individual performance. I'm talking about maintaining appropriate security standards, regardless of how long someone has been working in sensitive areas." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez's replacement for evening duty, a young officer whose nervousness about taking responsibility for communications coordination was evident in his careful attention to the handover briefing. Bobby recognized the pattern of new officers struggling to master the complex protocols that experienced personnel handled with routine competence. "Sir, I'm ready to assume responsibility for evening communications monitoring," the young lieutenant announced, his voice carrying the kind of formal precision that suggested recent graduation from officer training programs. "Are there any ongoing operations that require special attention?" Brooks accepted the evening briefing folder, his manner shifting into the authoritative tone he used when providing guidance to subordinate officers. "Standard monitoring protocols are in effect. The secure channels have been clear all afternoon, and equipment status is normal across all systems." Bobby observed the handover process while continuing his cleaning routine, recognizing the careful attention to detail that characterized military communications protocols. The young lieutenant's nervousness was understandable given the responsibility for maintaining contact with units spread across multiple time zones, but his preparation appeared thorough, and his attention to protocol suggested proper training. "Mr. Chen will be finishing his cleaning routine shortly," Brooks added, gesturing toward Bobby as if he were part of the equipment inventory being transferred to evening supervision. "Make sure civilian employees follow proper procedures when working around classified systems." The young lieutenant nodded seriously, clearly taking Brooks' guidance as important instruction about security protocols. Bobby finished cleaning the last communication cabinet and began gathering his supplies, his movements indicating preparation to conclude his work in the sensitive area. "Thank you for your attention to security, sir," the lieutenant said to Brooks, his tone carrying genuine appreciation for guidance from a more experienced officer. "I'll ensure proper supervision of all personnel working in this area." Bobby pushed his cart toward the communications center's exit, his departure timed to avoid any appearance of lingering around sensitive equipment. As he reached the doorway, he heard Brooks continuing his informal mentorship of the young lieutenant, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that established expectations about civilian employee supervision. "The key is maintaining professional distance while ensuring that support staff understand their limitations," Brooks was explaining. "Civilian employees provide necessary services, but they don't have the background to fully understand the implications of what they're observing." Bobby paused briefly at the doorway, his back to the conversation, but his attention focused on Brooks' continued characterization of civilian employees as inherently limited in their understanding of military operations. The comment carried particular irony given Bobby's extensive experience with the same communication systems that the young lieutenant was now learning to monitor. "I understand, sir," the lieutenant replied, his tone suggesting acceptance of Brooks' guidance about maintaining appropriate boundaries with support staff. "Proper security requires constant vigilance." Bobby stepped into the corridor, leaving the communications center to the evening shift personnel who would monitor radio traffic and coordinate communications throughout the night. His cart rolled smoothly across the polished floor as he moved toward his next assignment, the familiar weight of his custodial duties providing cover for the thoughts and memories that Brooks' comments had triggered. The corridor outside the communications center was quieter during the evening hours, with most day-shift personnel having departed for their off-duty activities. Bobby's route took him past offices where individual lights remained on, indicating personnel working late to complete administrative tasks or prepare for the following day's activities. The building's energy had shifted from the busy productivity of daytime operations to the focused concentration of evening work. As Bobby worked his way through the administrative corridor, he encountered Private First Class Tyler Jackson, a young soldier responsible for distributing evening mail and collecting outgoing correspondence from various offices. Jackson was new to Fort Harrison, his uniform still crisp with the kind of attention to detail that characterized soldiers fresh from basic training. "Evening, Mr. Chen," Jackson said, his greeting carrying the polite respect that well-trained soldiers showed to all base personnel regardless of their civilian or military status. "Working late tonight?" "Standard evening routine," Bobby replied, his tone carrying the professional courtesy that had characterized his interactions with base personnel throughout his 3 years of employment. "How are you adjusting to Fort Harrison?" Jackson's face brightened with the enthusiasm of a young soldier eager to discuss his new assignment. "It's a great base, sir. The NCOs have been very helpful with learning the administrative procedures, and everyone seems committed to maintaining high standards." Bobby nodded approvingly, recognizing in Jackson the kind of positive attitude that characterized successful military personnel. Good leadership makes all the difference in military service. You're fortunate to be assigned to a unit that takes training seriously. Yes, sir, Jackson agreed, though his expression carried slight confusion about Bobby's familiarity with military culture and training standards. You seem to understand military operations pretty well for a civilian employee. Bobby's response was carefully neutral, maintaining the vague explanation that had become his standard approach to questions about his background knowledge. You pick up quite a bit working around military personnel for several years. The basics become familiar. Jackson seemed satisfied with the explanation, though his expression suggested continued curiosity about Bobby's apparent familiarity with military terminology and procedures. Well, you certainly understand the importance of attention to detail. Your work has always been very thorough. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Captain Brooks' voice echoing from the communications center, where he was apparently continuing his informal mentorship of the evening duty officer. His words carried clearly down the corridor, their content focusing on the importance of maintaining proper security protocols when supervising civilian employees. The problem with civilian workers, Brooks was saying, his voice projecting with the authority of someone accustomed to having his opinions heard and respected, is that they don't understand the broader implications of military operations. They see equipment and procedures, but they lack the training to comprehend the strategic significance. Jackson's expression shifted slightly, his discomfort with Brooks' characterization evident in the way his attention moved between Bobby and the source of the captain's voice. The young soldier had been trained to respect commissioned officers, but he also understood the importance of treating all base personnel with appropriate courtesy. Sir, Jackson said carefully, his voice low enough to avoid carrying back to the communications center. Mr. Chen has always seemed very professional and security-conscious in his work. Bobby appreciated Jackson's subtle support, though he maintained his neutral expression to avoid drawing additional attention to the conversation. Captain Brooks is correct about the importance of security protocols. Everyone needs to understand their responsibilities. The diplomatic response satisfied Jackson, while avoiding any challenge to Brooks's authority or opinions. Bobby had learned that civilian employees were expected to accept criticism from military personnel without protest, regardless of the accuracy or fairness of such characterizations. I should finish distributing the evening mail, Jackson said, his tone suggesting some urgency to conclude the conversation before Brooks might overhear and interpret their discussion as inappropriate familiarity between ranks. Have a good evening, Mr. Chen. Bobby resumed his cleaning routine as Jackson continued down the corridor with his mail distribution duties. The brief interaction had provided another example of the respect that Bobby had earned from personnel who worked with him regularly, contrasted against the casual dismissal from officers who knew him only as a custodian rather than as a person with his own history and expertise. The evening progressed with familiar rhythm as Bobby completed his assigned route through Building 47. The administrative offices were largely empty now, with only essential personnel remaining to handle overnight operations and emergency communications. Bobby's work in these areas proceeded without interruption, allowing him to maintain the steady pace that had characterized his employment at Fort Harrison. As he worked, Bobby became aware of voices carrying from the communications center, where Captain Brooks was apparently concluding his extended mentorship session with the evening duty officer. The conversation had shifted from security protocols to broader discussions of military culture and the importance of maintaining proper standards in all aspects of base operations. Remember, Brooks was saying, his voice carrying the kind of final authority that concluded instructional sessions. Military excellence requires constant attention to detail and proper respect for the chain of command. Everyone on this base has a role to play, but some roles are more critical than others. Bobby finished cleaning the last office in his evening route, his work completed with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized his performance throughout his 3 years at Fort Harrison. The building around him had settled into its overnight rhythm, with only essential personnel remaining to monitor communications and maintain security. As he prepared to conclude his shift and return his equipment to the custodial supply area, Bobby reflected on the day's interactions and the casual assumptions that had characterized his encounters with Captain Brooks. The captain's comments about civilian employees and their supposed limitations had been delivered with the kind of authority that brooked no contradiction, establishing clear boundaries between military service and civilian support functions. Bobby understood that his current role placed him firmly in the civilian support category, regardless of his previous military experience or the depth of his understanding of the operations conducted around him. The tattoo hidden beneath his sleeve carried memories of radio transmissions that had coordinated combat operations and saved soldiers' lives, but those experiences remained invisible to personnel who saw only his current function as a custodian. The evening's events had reinforced the pattern of casual dismissal that would make subsequent revelations all the more powerful. Bobby remained exactly what he appeared to be to most observers: a reliable civilian employee who understood his place in the military hierarchy and performed his duties without requiring special attention or accommodation. As he pushed his cart toward the service elevator for the final time that day, Bobby caught sight of his reflection in the polished metal doors. The image showed an aging custodian concluding another routine shift, but beneath the surface lay memories and experiences that would reshape everything once they were finally revealed. The hidden tattoo pulsed with phantom heat, carrying the preserved words of a soldier whose final transmission had been received by ears that understood both the technical protocols and the human cost of military communications. The elevator doors closed behind Bobby and his cart, ending another day of invisible service in a building where assumption and reality existed in careful separation, waiting for the moment when hidden truths would finally surface and transform everyone's understanding of the quiet man who had been cleaning their offices with such professional competence. The morning sun cast sharp angles through the windows of Building 47 as Colonel Patricia Williams arrived for what she expected to be another routine day of command responsibilities at Fort Harrison. Her driver had dropped her at the main entrance precisely at 0700. Allowing her time to review overnight reports and prepare for the morning briefing with her senior staff. The base was operating at peak efficiency under her leadership, but the weight of command never allowed for complacency. Colonel Williams had assumed command of Fort Harrison 6 months earlier, bringing with her a reputation for operational excellence and unwavering commitment to the welfare of personnel under her authority. Her office on the third floor of Building 47 provided a strategic view of the installation's key facilities, but this morning her attention was focused inward on personnel reports that required her immediate attention. The administrative corridor was bustling with the familiar energy of a military installation beginning its daily operations. Personnel moved with purpose between offices. Their conversations focused on training schedules, equipment maintenance, and the countless details that kept Fort Harrison functioning as a critical component of America's military readiness. Colonel Williams navigated this environment with the practiced efficiency of a career officer who understood that effective leadership required constant attention to both strategic objectives and individual personnel needs. As she approached the elevator that would take her to the command suite, Colonel Williams noticed the custodial staff beginning their morning routines. The sight was unremarkable in itself, but it triggered thoughts about the civilian employees who provided essential support services throughout the installation. Her predecessor had briefed her on the importance of maintaining positive relationships with support staff, emphasizing that mission success depended on everyone understanding their role in the larger organizational structure. The elevator arrived with its characteristic mechanical precision, and Colonel Williams stepped inside alongside several junior officers who were clearly nervous about sharing transportation with the base commander. Their conversation ceased immediately upon her entrance, replaced by the kind of respectful silence that military protocol demanded when junior personnel encountered senior leadership in confined spaces. "Good morning," Colonel Williams said, her tone carrying the professional warmth that effective commanders use to put subordinates at ease. "I trust everyone is prepared for another productive day." The chorus of responses carried genuine enthusiasm mixed with appropriate military courtesy. Colonel Williams had learned early in her career that leadership required balancing authority with accessibility, ensuring that personnel understood both the importance of discipline and the value of individual contribution to collective success. The elevator reached the third floor, and Colonel Williams stepped into the corridor that housed the senior leadership offices. Her aide was waiting with the morning briefing materials, but before she could focus on command responsibilities, an unexpected encounter would transform her understanding of one of Fort Harrison's most invisible employees. Bobby Chen was emptying wastebaskets near the elevator bank, his movements carrying the methodical precision that characterized his work throughout Building 47. His custodial cart was positioned to allow easy access while minimizing disruption to personnel movement, demonstrating the kind of professional awareness that had made him a reliable fixture in the administrative complex. Colonel Williams barely noticed Bobby's presence as she moved toward her office, her attention focused on the briefing materials that would dominate her morning schedule. The sight of custodial staff had become so familiar over her months at Fort Harrison that individual employees had blended into the background of routine operations. It was purely by chance that Bobby's sleeve caught on the edge of his cart as he lifted a heavy wastebasket, pulling the fabric up his forearm and exposing the faded tattoo that he had kept hidden for 3 years. The ink was dark against his weathered skin, a series of letters and numbers that meant nothing to casual observers but carried devastating significance for anyone who understood military radio protocols. Colonel Williams stopped walking. Her briefing materials suddenly felt weightless in her hands as her eyes focused on the exposed tattoo with laser intensity. The letters and numbers were unmistakable. Phoenix Actual November 19 Echo Out. The call sign and coordinates that had been seared into her memory for 5 years, representing the last communication from her son before an enemy mortar round ended his life in the mountains of Afghanistan. "Excuse me," Colonel Williams said, her voice carrying an edge that caused Bobby to look up immediately. "That tattoo on your arm." Bobby glanced down at his exposed forearm, realizing that his carefully maintained secret had been revealed by a moment of carelessness. He quickly pulled his sleeve down, but the damage was already done. Colonel Williams had seen enough to recognize the significance of the ink that he had carried for 5 years. "It's nothing important, ma'am," Bobby said quietly, his voice carrying the neutral tone he had perfected for interactions with military personnel who might ask uncomfortable questions about his background. But Colonel Williams stepped closer, her command presence filling the corridor as she focused entirely on the custodian whose hidden tattoo had triggered memories that she carried every day. "Phoenix Actual November 1-9 Echo Out." That was Lieutenant Michael Williams' final transmission from Forward Operating Base Phoenix on November 19, 2019. The corridor fell silent as Bobby realized that his carefully constructed anonymity was crumbling in real time. The woman standing before him wasn't just another officer questioning a civilian employee about suspicious markings. She was Colonel Patricia Williams, and the son whose final words were preserved in Bobby's skin had been her child. "Ma'am," Bobby said carefully, understanding that this moment would reshape everything about his position at Fort Harrison. "I can explain." Colonel Williams' composure was fracturing as the implications of Bobby's tattoo became clear. "You were there. You heard his final transmission." Bobby nodded slowly, his 3 years of maintained silence ending in a single moment of recognition. "Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, 3rd Communications Battalion. I was Lieutenant Williams' radio operator at Forward Operating Base Phoenix." The words hung in the air between them, transforming Bobby from an invisible custodian into the last person to hear her son's voice before he died, serving his country in a remote mountain outpost half a world away. Colonel Williams' professional composure cracked as she absorbed the reality that the man who had been cleaning her building for 6 months was the same soldier who had received Michael's final transmission. "You've been here all this time," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of shock and something that might have been gratitude. "You've been working here, and I never knew." Bobby's expression carried the weight of 5 years of carrying memories that belonged to someone else's family. "I retired 3 years ago and took this position. I never expected you to be assigned to Fort Harrison." The corridor had attracted attention as other personnel noticed the intense conversation between the base commander and a member of the custodial staff. Captain Brooks was among those who had emerged from nearby offices, his expression carrying confusion about why Colonel Williams was engaged in what appeared to be serious discussion with a civilian employee. "Colonel," Brooks said, approaching with the kind of cautious authority that junior officers used when they suspected their commanding officer might need assistance with a personnel issue. "Is there a problem with one of the civilian employees?" Colonel Williams turned to face Brooks, her expression carrying an intensity that immediately indicated this was not a routine interaction. "Captain Brooks, I'd like you to meet Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, formerly of the 3rd Communications Battalion. He was my son's radio operator in Afghanistan." Brooks' confidence evaporated instantly as he processed the information that the custodian he had spent months dismissing as an unremarkable civilian employee was actually a combat veteran who had served alongside the colonel's deceased son. His face went through a series of expressions as he struggled to reconcile his assumptions with the reality that was being revealed in real time. "Sir," Brooks stammered, his usual authority replaced by obvious confusion and growing embarrassment. "I had no idea that Mr. Chen was a veteran." Colonel Williams' attention remained focused on Bobby, her command presence temporarily subdued by the personal significance of their encounter. "Tell me about Michael's final transmission." "I never received the complete details of what happened that day." Bobby's posture straightened slightly, muscle memory responding to a direct question from a superior officer, even though he now wore civilian clothes rather than military uniform. "Lieutenant Williams maintained radio contact for 47 minutes during the enemy attack, coordinating close air support and medical evacuation requests. His final transmission came after he'd been wounded but continued directing operations to ensure all personnel were evacuated safely." Colonel Williams closed her eyes briefly, absorbing details about her son's final moments that had been absent from the official report she had received. "What exactly did he say in that last transmission?" Bobby's voice carried the steady precision of someone reciting information that had been burned into his memory. "Phoenix Actual November 1-9, Echo out. Tell my mother I kept my promise. Tell her the Marines came home. Phoenix Actual, out." The corridor was completely silent as Colonel Williams absorbed the words that her son had transmitted in his final moments, thinking of her even as enemy fire surrounded his position. Her professional composure finally broke as she understood that Bobby had carried those words for 5 years, preserving them in ink on his skin like a sacred trust. "He was thinking of me," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of raw emotion that command responsibilities rarely allowed her to express. "He never stopped talking about you," Bobby replied, his voice gentle but clear. During quiet moments at the base, he would tell stories about his mother who had taught him that Marines always bring each other home. He kept that promise, even at the cost of his own life. Captain Brooks stood frozen nearby, his face reflecting the growing realization that every interaction he'd had with Bobby Chen had been conducted in complete ignorance of the man's military service and personal connection to the base commander's family. His casual dismissals and condescending comments about civilian employees suddenly carried weight that made him visibly uncomfortable. Other personnel had gathered in the corridor, drawn by the unusual sight of the base commander engaged in intense conversation with a member of the custodial staff. The crowd included Lieutenant Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant Thompson, and several other personnel who had worked around Bobby for months without understanding his background or the significance of his presence at Fort Harrison. Colonel Williams composed herself with visible effort, her command training reasserting itself even as she processed the emotional impact of Bobby's revelation. "Staff Sergeant Chen, I think we need to have a longer conversation about your service record and your current position here." "Yes, ma'am," Bobby replied, his military bearing becoming more evident as he responded to direct orders from a superior officer. "I serve at your pleasure." The formal military language caused another visible reaction from Captain Brooks, who was beginning to understand that his assumptions about civilian employees had been catastrophically wrong in at least one case. His usual confidence had been replaced by obvious discomfort as he contemplated the implications of his previous interactions with Bobby. "Captain Brooks," Colonel Williams said, her tone carrying command authority that left no room for misunderstanding. I want you to understand that Staff Sergeant Chen has more combat experience in communications operations than anyone currently assigned to this installation. His service record includes deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, where he coordinated radio traffic for special operations units. Brooks' face went pale as he processed the information that the man he had lectured about understanding his place in the military hierarchy was actually a decorated combat veteran whose experience exceeded his own. "Ma'am, I apologize for any misunderstanding about Mr. Chen's background." Colonel Williams' expression made it clear that misunderstanding was an inadequate characterization of Brooks' behavior toward Bobby. "Staff Sergeant Chen will be receiving appropriate recognition for his service, and I expect all personnel to treat him with the respect that his record deserves." The gathered crowd of personnel began to disperse as word spread throughout Building 47 that the quiet custodian who had worked among them for 3 years was actually a combat veteran with a personal connection to the base commander's family. The revelation transformed Bobby's status from invisible support staff to honored veteran in a matter of minutes. Bobby remained standing in the corridor as the crowd dispersed, his custodial cart nearby but somehow rendered irrelevant by the morning's revelations. His 3 years of maintained anonymity had ended permanently, replaced by recognition that would reshape his role at Fort Harrison and his relationship with the military community he had served, both in uniform and as a civilian employee. Colonel Williams extended her hand to Bobby, offering the kind of formal respect that one veteran provided to another. "Staff Sergeant Chen, thank you for carrying my son's final words. Thank you for keeping his promise alive." Bobby shook her hand firmly, his grip carrying the strength of someone who had once coordinated life-and-death communications under enemy fire. "It was an honor to serve with Lieutenant Williams, ma'am. He was an exceptional officer and a good man." The conversation continued as Colonel Williams invited Bobby to her office for a private discussion about his service record and his future role at Fort Harrison. As they walked down the corridor together, the transformation was complete. Bobby Chen was no longer the invisible custodian who cleaned floors and emptied wastebaskets. He was Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a decorated combat veteran whose presence at Fort Harrison represented a living connection to the sacrifices made by American warriors in distant places. The custodial cart remained in the corridor, abandoned but somehow transformed from a symbol of invisible service into a reminder that honor and sacrifice often existed in places where they were least expected. Bobby's tattoo was no longer hidden beneath long sleeves, but had become a bridge between past service and present recognition, preserving the final words of a fallen Marine whose promise had been kept by the man who received his last transmission. Captain Brooks remained in the corridor long after Colonel Williams and Bobby had departed for their private conversation. His confidence had been replaced by the uncomfortable realization that his assumptions about civilian employees had been fundamentally wrong, and that his casual dismissals had been directed at a man whose service record exceeded his own experience and authority. The morning's revelations would reshape relationships throughout Fort Harrison as personnel absorbed the lesson that honor and sacrifice often existed in unexpected places, carried by quiet individuals whose current roles revealed nothing about their previous service to the nation. Bobby Chen's transformation from invisible custodian to honored veteran served as a permanent reminder that respect should be earned through character rather than assumed through position, and that the most important stories were often carried by those who spoke the least about their own experiences. The tattoo that had remained hidden for 3 years had finally revealed its secret, connecting a mother to her son's final words and transforming everyone's understanding of the quiet man who had been serving among them with such professional competence. The promise that Lieutenant Michael Williams had made to bring his Marines home had been kept not only through his sacrifice, but through the memory of the man who received his final transmission and carried those words forward into a new chapter of recognition and respect. 3 weeks after the revelation in the corridor of Building 47, Fort Harrison had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The story of Bobby Chen's hidden identity had spread throughout the installation with the kind of careful reverence that military communities reserved for tales of authentic heroism and sacrifice. Personnel who had worked alongside Bobby for 3 years found themselves viewing their interactions through an entirely different lens, understanding that they had been in the presence of someone whose service record commanded genuine respect. Colonel Patricia Williams had spent those weeks making arrangements that would fundamentally alter Bobby's role at Fort Harrison, while honoring both his past service and his personal connection to her family. The process required navigating complex personnel regulations and security clearances, but her determination to provide appropriate recognition had overcome every bureaucratic obstacle. Bobby's service record, when fully reviewed, revealed decorations and commendations that placed him among the most distinguished communications specialists of his generation. The Heritage Hall auditorium had been prepared with the kind of attention to detail that characterized significant military ceremonies. American flags flanked the stage, and the installation's senior leadership occupied the front rows in their dress uniforms. The ceremony was not merely about recognizing one individual's service, but about acknowledging the broader principle that honor often existed in unexpected places, carried by individuals whose current circumstances revealed nothing about their previous contributions to the nation's security. Bobby stood in the small preparation room adjacent to the auditorium, wearing his dress blue uniform for the first time in over 3 years. The decorations on his chest told the story of 2 decades of military service, including deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, where his communications expertise had supported operations that saved countless lives. The transformation from custodial coveralls to military dress uniform was more than cosmetic. It represented the restoration of identity that had been voluntarily surrendered, but never truly abandoned. Colonel Williams entered the preparation room with the ceremonial items that would complete Bobby's recognition. Her expression carried the kind of controlled emotion that characterized commanders, who understood the weight of the moments they were privileging to witness. The past 3 weeks had allowed her to process the full significance of Bobby's presence at Fort Harrison and the connection he represented to her son's final service. "Staff Sergeant Chen," she said formally, though her tone carried warmth that transcended military protocol. "Are you prepared for the ceremony?" "Yes, ma'am," Bobby replied, his bearing reflecting the military discipline that 3 years of civilian employment had not erased. "Thank you for arranging this recognition. It means more than you know." Colonel Williams nodded, understanding that the ceremony was significant, not just for Bobby but for everyone who would witness the formal acknowledgement of service that had been hidden in plain sight for 3 years. The installation needs to understand that heroism often wears different uniforms, and sometimes it wears no uniform at all. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the preparation room door. Staff Sergeant David Thompson entered, his expression carrying the kind of respectful attention that characterized senior NCOs when they interacted with decorated veterans. Thompson had been among the most vocal supporters of Bobby's recognition, having worked closely with him and recognized the professional competence that suggested deeper experience. "Sir," Thompson said to Bobby, using the formal address that reflected Bobby's newly restored status within the military hierarchy. "The auditorium is full. Word about the ceremony spread throughout the base, and personnel wanted to be present for your recognition." Bobby absorbed the information with visible surprise. His expectation had been for a small, formal ceremony, attended primarily by senior leadership and administrative personnel. The news that the broader Fort Harrison community had chosen to attend suggested that his story had resonated beyond the immediate circle of people who had known him as a custodian. "Any particular personnel in attendance that I should be aware of?" Bobby asked, his tone carrying curiosity about who had chosen to witness his formal recognition. Thompson's expression shifted to one of gentle satisfaction. "Captain Brooks is present, sir. He specifically requested permission to attend, and asked if he could speak with you after the ceremony." Bobby nodded thoughtfully, understanding that Brooks's attendance represented an opportunity for reconciliation rather than continued conflict. The captain's behavior toward civilian employees had been wrong, but it had stemmed from ignorance rather than malice. Military service taught the importance of learning from mistakes and growing through adversity. Colonel Williams checked her watch, noting that the ceremony was scheduled to begin in 5 minutes. "Staff Sergeant Chen, There's one more element to today's recognition that we haven't discussed. The ceremony will include the formal reading of your son's final transmission with your permission. The base needs to understand the connection between past service and present sacrifice. Bobby's expression reflected deep consideration of the request. Sharing Michael Williams' final words in a public forum would transform them from private memory into institutional legacy, ensuring that the young Marine's sacrifice would be remembered by future generations of service members. The decision carried emotional weight, but it also offered the opportunity to honor a fallen comrade in the most meaningful way possible. "Yes, ma'am," Bobby said finally. "Lieutenant Williams' words deserve to be heard. His sacrifice should be remembered." The preparation room fell silent as the three military professionals absorbed the significance of what was about to occur. The ceremony would not only recognize Bobby's service, but would also preserve the memory of a young Marine whose final transmission had been carried forward by the man who received it. The connection between past and present would be formally acknowledged before the entire Fort Harrison community. Colonel Williams led the way toward the auditorium, with Bobby and Thompson following in formation that reflected their respective ranks and roles in the ceremony. The corridor outside Heritage Hall buzzed with the quiet energy that characterized significant military events, where personnel understood they were witnessing something that would become part of the installation's permanent legacy. The auditorium doors opened to reveal a capacity crowd of military personnel, civilian employees, and family members who had come to witness Bobby's recognition. The sight was overwhelming for someone who had spent 3 years working in anonymity, but it also represented the military community's understanding that authentic service deserved authentic recognition, regardless of the circumstances under which it was revealed. Bobby walked down the center aisle with the measured pace that characterized formal military processions. Personnel throughout the auditorium rose to their feet in a display of respect that acknowledged not just his individual service, but the broader principle that honor existed in many forms. The sight of familiar faces among the crowd reminded Bobby that his 3 years as a custodian had created relationships that would continue beyond his restored military status. Private First Class Tyler Jackson was among those standing at attention, his young face reflecting the kind of inspiration that came from witnessing authentic military values in action. Jackson had been one of the few personnel to treat Bobby with consistent respect during his custodial employment, and his presence at the ceremony represented the continuity between past courtesy and present recognition. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez sat in the third row, her expression carrying obvious emotion as she witnessed the formal acknowledgement of someone she had worked alongside for months without understanding his background. Her interactions with Bobby had always been professional, but she now understood that her courtesy toward a civilian employee had actually been directed toward a decorated combat veteran whose experience exceeded her own. Captain Brooks occupied a seat near the back of the auditorium, his presence representing a level of moral courage that was often more difficult than physical bravery. His attendance at the ceremony meant facing the full weight of his previous behavior toward Bobby, but it also demonstrated his commitment to learning from his mistakes and growing as both an officer and a person. Colonel Williams approached the podium with the bearing of a commander who understood that leadership required creating moments of meaning for the personnel under her authority. The ceremony was about more than recognizing one individual's service. It was about reinforcing the values that made military service honorable and ensuring that those values were transmitted to future generations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Williams began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the auditorium, "we are gathered today to recognize service that has been hidden in plain sight for 3 years. Staff Sergeant Bobby Chen served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan, where his communications expertise supported operations that saved countless lives and ensured mission success under the most challenging conditions." The formal recitation of Bobby's service record filled the auditorium with details that few present had known. His decorations included the Bronze Star with Valor device, the Purple Heart, and multiple commendations for meritorious service in combat zones. The accumulation of honors painted a picture of someone whose contributions to military operations had been significant and sustained over 2 decades of active duty. Staff Sergeant Chen's final deployment was to Forward Operating Base Phoenix in Afghanistan, where he served as Senior Communications Specialist for 3rd Communications Battalion, Colonel Williams continued. It was there that he received the final transmission from Lieutenant Michael Williams, my son, who gave his life ensuring that his Marines came home safely. The auditorium fell into complete silence as the personal connection between Bobby and Colonel Williams was formally acknowledged. The revelation that Bobby had been present during her son's final moments added profound emotional weight to the ceremony, transforming it from routine recognition into something approaching sacred ritual. Bobby stepped forward to the microphone, his military bearing evident in every movement despite his 3 years away from active duty. The auditorium waited respectfully as he prepared to share words that had been carried in silence for 5 years, preserved in ink beneath his sleeve like a sacred trust between warriors. Lieutenant Michael Williams' final transmission came during an enemy attack on Forward Operating Base Phoenix on November 19, 2019, Bobby said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium with clear precision. He had been wounded but continued coordinating the evacuation of personnel under his command. His final words were, "Phoenix Actual, November 1-9, Echo out. Tell my mother I kept my promise. Tell her the Marines came home. Phoenix Actual, out." The weight of those words settled over the auditorium like a physical presence, connecting everyone present to the sacrifice of a young Marine who had thought of his mother even as enemy fire surrounded his position. Colonel Williams maintained her composure through visible effort, understanding that her son's final words were now part of Fort Harrison's permanent legacy. Bobby rolled up his sleeve to reveal the tattoo that had remained hidden for 3 years, the ink dark against his weathered skin as he displayed the permanent memorial he had carried since returning from Afghanistan. The sight of Michael Williams' final transmission preserved in Bobby's flesh created a connection between past sacrifice and present recognition that would be remembered by everyone in attendance. "This tattoo represents more than personal memory," Bobby continued. "It represents the promise that those who serve will not be forgotten, that their sacrifice will be carried forward by those who witness their courage." Lieutenant Williams kept his promise to bring his Marines home. "I made a promise to carry his final words forward, and today that promise is fulfilled." The ceremony continued with the presentation of a special recognition award that acknowledged Bobby's unique service both in uniform and as a civilian employee. Colonel Williams performed the presentation with the kind of formal precision that characterized significant military honors, but her expression carried personal gratitude that transcended official protocol. As the ceremony concluded, personnel throughout the auditorium rose and sustained applause that acknowledged not just Bobby's individual recognition, but the broader principles that the event represented. The applause continued as Bobby walked back down the center aisle, but this time he moved as Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, honored veteran, rather than as an invisible custodian whose service had gone unrecognized. The reception following the ceremony took place in the auditorium lobby, where personnel had the opportunity to speak personally with Bobby about his service and his connection to Fort Harrison. The conversations revealed the depth of respect that his 3 years of quiet competence had earned, even from people who had not understood his military background. Captain Brooks approached Bobby during the reception, his expression carrying the kind of humble sincerity that characterized genuine apologies. The past 3 weeks had given Brooks time to fully comprehend the magnitude of his errors in judgment and the casual disrespect he had shown toward someone whose service record exceeded his own experience. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Brooks said formally, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond anything I can express in words. My behavior toward you was inexcusable, and I want you to know that I've learned from this experience in ways that will change how I interact with everyone under my command." Bobby accepted the apology with the grace that characterized veterans who understood that military service was about growth and learning rather than maintaining perfection. "Captain Brooks, military service teaches us that we all make mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them and grow as leaders and as people. The conversation between Bobby and Brooks continued for several minutes, establishing a foundation for mutual respect that would characterize their future interactions. Brooks' willingness to acknowledge his errors publicly demonstrated the kind of moral courage that military service was designed to develop, and Bobby's gracious acceptance of the apology reflected the wisdom that came from years of experience with human nature under stress. Lieutenant Rodriguez joined the conversation, her expression carrying obvious relief at the resolution of tensions that had characterized the weeks following Bobby's revelation. Her interactions with Bobby had always been professional, but she now understood that her courtesy toward a civilian employee had been more significant than she had realized. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Rodriguez said, "I wanted to thank you for your patience with all of us who didn't understand your background. Your professionalism throughout your time here set an example that I hope to follow in my own career." Bobby's response reflected the kind of leadership philosophy that had characterized his military service. "Lieutenant Rodriguez, military service is about supporting each other regardless of rank or position. Your professionalism towards civilian employees was exactly right, and it would have been right even if I had never served in uniform." The reception continued with conversations that established Bobby's new role within the Fort Harrison community. Colonel Williams had arranged for him to transition from custodial duties to a position as Senior Communications Advisor, where his expertise could directly support training and operations. The change represented not just recognition of his past service but utilization of his knowledge to benefit current and future military personnel. Staff Sergeant Thompson approached Bobby with news about the practical arrangements for his new position. "Sir, your office in the communications center is ready, and I've prepared briefing materials on current systems and protocols. We're looking forward to learning from your experience." Bobby nodded appreciatively, understanding that his new role would allow him to contribute directly to mission effectiveness while maintaining the connection to Fort Harrison that had become important to him over the past 3 years. The transition from custodian to advisor represented the completion of a circle that had begun with his retirement from active duty. As the reception wound down, Bobby found himself standing near the memorial wall that displayed photographs of Fort Harrison's fallen personnel. Lieutenant Michael Williams' photograph occupied a place of honor among the images of service members who had given their lives in service to their country. The sight of Michael's youthful face reminded Bobby that recognition and ceremony were meaningful only insofar as they preserved the memory of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Colonel Williams joined Bobby near the memorial wall, her presence creating a moment of shared reflection on the connection between past loss and present recognition. The ceremony had been about honoring Bobby's service, but it had also been about ensuring that her son's sacrifice would be remembered by future generations of military personnel. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Colonel Williams said quietly, "thank you for keeping Michael's promise alive. Thank you for carrying his words forward until they could find their proper home." Bobby's response carried the weight of 5 years of carrying another family's grief alongside his own memories of service and sacrifice. "Colonel Williams, your son was a warrior who understood that military service is about something larger than ourselves." His final words will now be part of Fort Harrison's permanent legacy, inspiring future generations to serve with the same courage and dedication. The conversation near the memorial wall concluded the formal ceremony, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter in Bobby's relationship with Fort Harrison and the military community that had finally recognized his true identity. His transformation from invisible custodian to honored veteran would serve as a permanent reminder that service and sacrifice often existed in unexpected places, carried by individuals whose current circumstances revealed nothing about their previous contributions to the nation's security. The weeks that followed Bobby's recognition ceremony brought fundamental changes to Fort Harrison's culture and operations. Personnel throughout the installation had absorbed the lesson that respect should be based on character rather than position, and that assumptions about civilian employees or support staff might conceal remarkable stories of service and sacrifice. The change was subtle but profound, reflected in countless daily interactions, where military personnel demonstrated enhanced appreciation for everyone who contributed to mission effectiveness. Bobby's new office in the Communications Center became a hub for training and professional development, where his experience with combat communications provided invaluable context for current operations. Young communications specialists sought his guidance on everything from technical procedures to leadership philosophy, understanding that they were learning from someone whose expertise had been tested under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Private First Class Tyler Jackson was among the most frequent visitors to Bobby's office, his enthusiasm for learning from a decorated veteran evident in every conversation. The young soldier had always treated Bobby with respect during his custodial employment, and that courtesy had now evolved into genuine mentorship that would influence Jackson's entire military career. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Jackson said during one of their regular discussions, "how do you maintain communication effectiveness when everything around you is falling apart?" Bobby's response drew from decades of experience with military communications under combat conditions. "The key is understanding that your voice might be the only thing standing between success and catastrophe. Every transmission matters, every protocol serves a purpose, and every soldier depending on your communication deserves your absolute best effort, regardless of the circumstances." The mentorship conversations that took place in Bobby's office represented the practical application of the ceremony's broader message about recognizing and utilizing the expertise that existed throughout the military community. Bobby's hidden knowledge had been wasted during his 3 years as a custodian, but his new role ensured that future communications personnel would benefit from his experience and wisdom. Captain Brooks had also become a regular presence in the communications center, where his interactions with Bobby reflected the genuine transformation that could occur when military personnel learned from their mistakes and committed to growth. The captain's behavior towards civilian employees and support staff had changed markedly following Bobby's recognition, demonstrating that the ceremony's impact extended far beyond one individual's status. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Brooks said during one of their collaborative sessions on training protocols, "I wanted you to know that I've been reviewing our procedures for recognizing and utilizing the expertise of all base personnel, regardless of their current position or employment status." Bobby's response reflected his understanding that lasting change required institutional commitment rather than individual conversion. Captain Brooks, "Military effectiveness depends on recognizing talent and experience wherever it exists. Some of the most valuable contributors to mission success might be wearing different uniforms or no uniforms at all." The ongoing conversations between Bobby and Brooks represented the kind of professional growth that military service was designed to promote, where errors in judgment became opportunities for learning and improvement, rather than sources of permanent conflict. Their collaboration on improving recognition procedures would ensure that future personnel would benefit from the lessons learned through Bobby's experience. Colonel Williams had also instituted regular meetings with Bobby to discuss broader questions of personnel management and recognition within Fort Harrison's command structure. Her leadership philosophy emphasized the importance of understanding and utilizing the full range of talent available within the military community, regardless of the form the talent might take. "Staff Sergeant Chen," Colonel Williams said during one of their command meetings, "your experience has taught us that we need to be more intentional about understanding the backgrounds and capabilities of everyone who contributes to our mission. What recommendations do you have for improving our recognition and utilization procedures?" Bobby's recommendations drew from his observation of Fort Harrison's culture during his 3 years of anonymous service. "Ma'am, I suggest implementing regular professional development sessions where all personnel have the opportunity to share their background and expertise. Military service creates a diverse community of experience, and much of that experience remains hidden unless we create opportunities for people to contribute in ways that match their capabilities." The institutional changes that resulted from Bobby's recognition would serve as a permanent legacy of the ceremony and its broader message about hidden service and unexpected expertise. Fort Harrison became a model for other installations seeking to maximize the contribution of all personnel, while maintaining the respect and recognition that military service deserved. The memorial garden behind Heritage Hall had become Bobby's preferred location for the informal mentorship sessions that had evolved from his new role as communications advisor. Young soldiers would often find him there during quiet moments, sharing stories about Lieutenant Michael Williams and discussing the principles that made military service meaningful and effective. "Staff Sergeant Chen," one young Marine asked during an evening conversation in the memorial garden. How do you honor the memory of fallen comrades while continuing to serve effectively yourself? Bobby's response drew from 5 years of carrying Michael Williams' final words and the understanding that had developed through his recognition and new role. You honor their memory by living the values they died defending. You serve effectively by understanding that your service is connected to everyone who served before you and everyone who will serve after you. The chain of service is unbroken, and each link strengthens all the others. The conversations in the memorial garden represented the most meaningful outcome of Bobby's recognition ceremony, ensuring that the lessons learned from his experience would be transmitted to future generations of military personnel. The young soldiers who gathered to learn from his experience would carry those lessons forward throughout their own careers, multiplying the impact of recognition beyond what any ceremony could achieve alone. As the seasons changed and Bobby's first year in his new role approached completion, Fort Harrison had become a different kind of military installation. The culture of recognition and respect that had developed following his ceremony created an environment where all personnel understood that their contributions mattered, and that their backgrounds deserved acknowledgement regardless of their current position or employment status. The tattoo that had remained hidden for 3 years continued to serve as a reminder of the promises that bound military personnel together across time and circumstance. Bobby's preservation of Michael Williams' final words had fulfilled one promise, but it had also created new obligations to ensure that the lessons learned from recognition and respect would continue to influence Fort Harrison's culture for years to come. The transformation of one man from invisible custodian to honored veteran had become the foundation for institutional change that would affect countless future personnel and their families. The promise that Marines would come home had been kept not only through sacrifice, but through the recognition that ensured no service would remain hidden and no contributor would remain invisible to the community they served. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.